light of recent events regarding the resource deal, a sad conclusion can be drawn. The Ukrainian people were not just betrayed, but their future generations, even unborn children, were mocked. The national idea of pride seemed like a ploy to strip everything away, turn them into a colony of slaves on plantations, and make them die for interests that aren't even their own. Oligarchs and corrupt officials cowardly took their capital and fled abroad, leaving behind the property of Johns and Toms, so to speak. Nature endowed Ukraine with incredible wealth. It is literally their land. The black soil is a blessing for agricultural lands. Whatever happens, a Ukrainian could be sure that at least there would be bread on their table. Until recently, Ukraine could feed 600 million people, while its population was only 40 million. On the geographical map, Ukraine holds a third of the world's black soil. Why geographical? How did it happen that such a rich Ukraine became so poor? They haven't belonged to Ukraine for a long time. This is shown by the analysis of ownership structure. In the early 90s, under the guidance of the IMF, Ukraine began privatizing agricultural lands by distributing so-called certificates. However, during the economic crisis, a significant portion of them was sold for next to nothing to local businessmen, later oligarchs. In 2001, a moratorium on further privatization was introduced, but by then 96% had already left state ownership. Oligarchs registered their property offshore. As a result, they paid not to Ukraine's treasury, but, for example, to Cyprus. Thus, while draining the resources from Ukrainian land, oligarchs got richer and Ukraine got nothing.
If Ukraine were adequate, if there were normal businessmen and officials there, then the wealth that Ukraine inherited after the collapse of the Soviet Union would have made Ukraine truly rich. Because there were enterprises, there were resources, everything was there, but all of it was stolen, all of it was sold, and so on.
In the 21st century, new schemes for land seizure appeared. First, a corrupt elite was created. They established legal conditions locally for transferring people's and states' property for next to nothing to distant foreign corporations. Since early 2014, Kiev has been flooded with such figures. Before the start of the Russian military operation, under IMF pressure to receive new financial tranches, Zelensky signed a law lifting the moratorium. He made black soil a commodity. So cheap that corporations could acquire lands for next to nothing. While the West, on one hand, firmly opposed any attempts at diplomatic negotiations to resolve the Ukraine-Russia conflict and instead insisted on escalating the conflict, sending fighters and tanks to Kiev, on the other hand, the prices for black soil were falling. The initial price ranged from $1,000 to $2,000 per hectare. This is the most fertile land in the world. In Europe, the price of land ranged from $4,000 to $70,000.
Yes, the situation is paradoxical, and I would even say cynical, because Ukrainians are fighting to return or sell what they didn't manage to from their national wealth in the form of valuable black soil to foreign companies and investors. In fact, they are fighting for foreign interests, if you think about it, because they were no longer the masters of their own land. Not to mention that even if, theoretically, the military conflict ends, the question of repaying the multi-billion loans and aid that Ukraine received, even just in the last 2 years for military actions, will arise. And they will have to pay back only with their subsoil and land.
In the last 10 years, foreigners have acquired 170,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. The land was bought by firms mainly based in the USA or owned by Americans. These are agribusiness and biotechnology giants like Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto. They bought 40% of Ukraine's arable land to grasp the scale. 3 American companies own more land in Ukraine than all of Italy, and the land was sold for a pittance. 28% of the land now belongs to Ukrainian oligarchs and agro holdings, which are actually owned by American, French, German, and Saudi companies.
When Zelensky promoted the idea of selling land, there were no Ukrainians or Ukraine involved. There were foreign companies. Now, no matter how much you sell resources, however much there is, it will not belong to Ukraine. The only thing they can do in Ukraine is plunder the remnants of past luxury. And now, when it comes to selling rare earth resources and more, there is no Ukrainian interest at all. They will just be like slaves working on plantations in the USA in the past. Now, Ukrainian slaves in traditional clothing will work for American masters to cheerful songs.
They were sold. Remember, the West sent tons of scrap metal as military aid to Ukraine on credit. Grants. They are not free. Americans are already demanding everything back to the last penny. Kiev officials are getting richer with accounts there in the West. Weapons are not sent to the front, but sold on the black market. Zelensky claims he doesn't know where the money went. And Ukrainians are fighting not for their land, but for the interests of global corporations that have taken over the country, their property. Zelensky, having sold the land, is also giving away the subsoil.
I'll carry you, dear, all the way to the house myself. I'll carry you, dear, all the way to the house.